Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about my own philosophy on this these days, and actually it falls very in line with a lot of well-known coaches out there. So it's not just me saying this is everyone from guys like Louis Simmons all the way up to really looking at even people like Dr. Mike Israetel, who have very conflicting views on training, right? They come from completely different camps of linear versus concurrent periodization, things like that. And one of the things that's interesting is that you'll even see Dr. Mike say that even for strength athletes, that he would much rather see strength athletes do many more hypertrophy type phases where they focus on maximum size, right? Where they focus upon maximum size as opposed to actual real strength work. And that in the long term, they end up being stronger at the end of those phases than if they did more strength phases, even when he's periodizing lifters. And we see the same thing when we look at people like Louis Simmons with what he does with Westside, which I'm a big fan of. And my training is obviously, at least loosely, if not in many cases, heavily based upon what he does. But a lot of the concepts are the same. And what you see guys like Louis saying is that only 10% of training is dedicated towards classic lifts, or even heavy work, really. Like when he says even classic lifts, if you look at their templates, that 10% actually includes bands, chain variations, deficit pulls, block pulls, things like that. So even then, his 10% includes oftentimes variations of those lifts. Because they come in and they do max work, right? They do max effort. And then everything else is geared around either his speed work or hypertrophy training with supplemental lifts. And the supplemental lifts take up a massive amount of the volume. Right, the speed work takes up a good amount of volume for those guys, good amount of it, but it actually has a large hypertrophic component also in its volume training. So people might start to ask the question of why is that? Well, it's because simply put, even though we could argue about the specificity of doing the big lifts, and we should, and yes, if you practice doing your classic lifts with specificity, you will obviously get better at them. Okay? No one's arguing that. The problem is that the amount of better that you get is relatively small. It is very small for very advanced lifters because we already know how to perform them. In other words, I haven't done a back squat in 10 months. And then I came in and walked in and hit a decently smooth 522 without having back squatted. I've done no conventional deadlifting. You guys have watched me come in and hit pretty heavy deficit conventional deadlifts, deadlifts against chains, things like that, where we're getting up there in weight without having performed the lift. And I'm not the exception to the rule. I don't want people to think that I've invented magical systems of training to do that. It literally has nothing to do with me. I am simply displaying through my own training what many experts who have far more years coaching or researching and everything else than I've ever had. Right? People who have more experience with me have developed many of these systems. I've learned to implement them. And that's what you see. So people will say, well, why is that? Because if you know how to squat, bench, and deadlift, or any other lift, you already know how to do it. A more experienced lifter is only going to tweak their technique a little bit, but if they walk in, if they're strong, they're still going to be pretty strong at those. And what do we know about advanced lifters? That almost every pound that you're able to lift or gain on any lift is going to be through hypertrophy. All right, that's it. Novice lifters are the ones who can get a lot stronger with minimal muscle gain, which is ironic because they're also the ones who can gain the most muscle. But those things go hand in hand. There's a reason we have novice lifters do a bunch of volume on the classic lifts, 3x5s, 5x5s. Why? Because they can both learn the lifts and because they are so small and so undertrained, they're too weak to reach any sort of real fatigue from axial loading and things on those big lifts. And if they approach anywhere near their maximum recoverable volume, even on the hardest lifts to recover from, like a deadlift or a squat, what happens? They grow, okay? because volume, training volume, effective volume, is the primary driver of hypertrophy. And so those lifters, if they do as much volume as they can handle on a squat, a bench press, a deadlift, some rows, they grow rapidly. They grow rapidly, and at the same time, they don't know how to perform the lifts well. So that large amount of skill work would actually make them stronger at all of those lifts, even if they weren't gaining muscle. But they need the skill work. They need the practice. They don't know how to perform those lifts. You know, the average lifter probably needs a couple of years of a lot of practice at the squat and the bench press in order to get good at them. But what happens when you get more advanced? You don't forget how to perform a bench press. Your technique might not be perfect. You don't forget how to perform a back squat. Your technique might not be perfect. So conversely, because you already have the skills, dedicating a lot of time to those may be a misuse of resources. Now, there will be people who say, well, Jason, this lifter, that lifter does the opposite of that. They come in and follow very high specificity and they're really, really strong. Yeah, that's true. That is true. But the fact of the matter is there are other lifters who are just as strong, if not stronger than them, who don't do that. There are lifters who don't do that, who are oftentimes beating them. So this is kind of an issue, isn't it? Because if that was the best approach, there wouldn't be a single person out there who beats them, who does the opposite. Yet they do. And here's what it comes down to. They're just doing hypertrophy work with those at a certain point. At a certain point, they are just taking their classic lifts and getting enough training volume in to grow from them. But the argument could be made that due to need for training variation, hitting different muscles, stimulus to fatigue ratios, that throwing all your efforts into those bigger lifts isn't always a good use of your training volume and resources. Because there are other lifts you could be doing that are easier to recover from that could possibly build more total muscle mass. And for example, you guys see me in this video doing my supplemental work for my benching. Doing sets of 10 on the incline, close grip incline, sets of 10 on the weighted dip, tricep extensions to failure. In other words, I'm building my front delts, my triceps, and my entire pec. That's what we're doing, right? Building those muscles up with training volume. And in many cases, we are hitting parts of the muscles that might not be as fully worked by the bench press. Also, with the exercise variation, what are we doing? We're avoiding risk of overuse. And that's the thing that people have to remember. Excessive use of the same exercises leads to overuse injuries. It leads to tendinitis. And a lot of these different variations that we're working with work the muscles at different angles, can help build support musculature, avoid overuse injuries, and therefore, if we can avoid tendinitis and overuse, we can push higher training volumes. Okay? The novice lifter doesn't need the exercise variation. They don't really benefit from all that because their pecs are so undersized, bench will make them big. Okay? We're not worried about overuse of the shoulder joint for a novice lifter whose 5 rep max is 180 pounds. Same thing, we're not worried about his tricep tendons. But we could very quickly get into a situation to where that person has lagging triceps. Maybe the upper part of their chest is lagging a bit. They're not growing always proportionately because the bench press doesn't load everything proportionately. All right, you're going to have different muscles you favor. Now, people will say, well, why should that matter? Because if those muscles are used in a lower ratio, they don't contribute that much to the 1 rep max other than they do. Because even a muscle that isn't one of the most important heads of a muscle for an exercise, if you make it bigger, if it contributes to the lift, it'll still contribute. And this way, by doing a lot of the variation and focusing on the higher training volumes, we can ensure that every muscle involved in the lift is maximally developed. And if you do that, you're going to be able to create maximum force. At a certain point, hypertrophy becomes more important than practice. And that point is definitely once you're through the novice phase, and it's something that grows larger and larger the more advanced that you get. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.